this morning. But that was so moving. Thank you. So we at PESI, we believe in listening to feedback. So each year after innovations, we pay close attention to hearing from all of you about all the ways we've screwed up. We take a breath and find out all the gaps and blind spots in our lineup, the new and diverse voices we've turned a deaf ear to, the groundbreaking clinical approaches that we've snubbed. But this year, we finally addressed one glaring omission in our programs: the absence of Canadians. Those Canadians clapping? So throughout this meeting, you'll hear from an all-star team of not just any Canadians, but Canadians who've been awarded the Order of Canada, or maybe it's appointed the Order of Canada. I don't even know. I'm just a boorish American. Gabor will set us straight. All I know is this year's marquee of speakers is more akin to the Edmonton Oilers than ever before. Yeah. People like Ruth Lanius, Leanne Campbell, and of course this morning's special guest and others that I'm obviously forgetting. When I first met this morning's Canadian keynoter back in 2018, when he first spoke at the Psychotherapy Networker Symposium in Washington, D.C., I honestly wasn't sure what to expect. I'd never met him before, and I had read, like many of you, his classic book on addictions, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And if you're a super fan like me, you probably read the hardcover. So I looked at the book jacket, and there he was, this man who wrote this book. And I don't know about you, but I'm used to authors putting on cheery, smiling, accessible photos of themselves in their book jacket. But instead, our speaker's profile photo looked more like an enigmatic mugshot. And when I first saw that picture of the man who wrote this book that I so loved, I must admit, I felt intimidated. Who is this guy with his wayward, Mick Jagger-ish curls, those soulful, brooding eyes that seem to peer into the heart of my soul? I immediately sensed trouble. And would this renowned physician who spent 20 years working with the most severely addicted and traumatized souls of Vancouver's impoverished East Side be one of the roughest neighborhoods that you'll find anywhere? This man who doesn't often smile in photographs, could he actually be kind and easy to work with? Or would he be one of those self-absorbed, high-maintenance presenters who make a conference organizer's life miserable? Well, since then, my dealings with not just this morning's keynoter, but many of the other Canadians here today, even previous keynote guests like Malcolm Gladwell, Alanis Morissette, have all taught me one important lesson. One core lesson I've learned as a conference organizer: keep inviting Canadians. Since then, I've got to get to know him as a friend. I've watched him rise to a kind of global notoriety for his teachings around trauma and the root cause of illness that I don't know if he ever imagined reaching. And what I can tell you is that whether he's interviewing Prince Harry on a live stream in front of millions, facing a critical journalist in the press, leading ayahuasca retreats in the jungles of Peru, or talking to me at his favorite Afghan restaurant in Vancouver, he is exactly the same Gabor, who to this day still drives an old car, goes to the local hardware store to buy salt for his driveway, like the rest of us mere mortals. And I've come to love him, like so many here, for his approachability, his conscious intention to acknowledge his own mistakes, his endless curiosity to learn and take on new challenges, his unwavering commitment to all of us in this field, the psychotherapy community. And it's not difficult for me to say that he is one of the hardest working teachers I have ever met, who's ever graced one of our conferences. He extends to me and everyone he meets the same genuine humility, courtesy, commitment to being of service as he did to those addicted souls on the east side of Vancouver. In other words, he's a man who truly walks the walk. So it is my privilege to introduce this morning one of the many, many reasons we should be grateful to live next door to Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, in the words of my esteemed mentor, Rich Simon, I give you psychotherapy's answer to Mick Jagger, Dr. Gabor Maté.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. So I have a dilemma this morning talking to you because I was preparing my talk and then I was reading one of the spiritual classics, the Tao by Lao Tzu, that was written about 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, around the same time that the Buddha was also active. And in the Tao, which means the way, Lao Tzu says, "He who knows doesn't speak, and he who speaks doesn't know." So I thought, where does that leave me this morning? You know. So what am I going to talk to you about? I want to talk to you about human freedom. I think when I consider what the role of psychotherapy is, it's all about freedom. And the question is, do we even have freedom? Now, some say that we don't. There's a very well-known neurobiologist, neuropsychologist, who's done great work, Robert Sapolsky, here at Stanford, who recently wrote a book called Determined. And in this book, Determined, he actually argues that there's no such thing as freedom. Let me quote him to you. When he says the book is called Determined, he means that we're predetermined. Basically, we're just shaped by our environment. He says, we're nothing more or less than the sum of that which you could not control, our biology, environments, and their interactions. Therefore, there's no such thing as free will, and blame and punishment are without ethical justification. Well, unfortunately, he's about 99% right. When we look at, whether we look at politics around the world, how free are people to really make conscious, informed decisions? And to what extent are they manipulated by forces much more powerful than they are? In the personal realm, how free are we? When you make your choices about who to fall in love with, who to be in a relationship with, how to react to situations, how to make the essentially important decisions in your life. How free are you? And to what degree are you governed by unconscious forces programmed before you had any choice in the matter? So when Sapolsky talks about the lack of freedom, he's describing a significant aspect of human reality. And the question is, does it have to be that way? Or can we attain freedom? And what does it take to attain freedom? And surely one of the things it takes to attain freedom is to question everything we're told, and to question our understanding of things, and to look at our own blind spots. There's that famous quote which is ascribed to Viktor Frankl, but he didn't say it. It was said by Rollo May, an American psychologist, and it has to do with between stimulus and response, there's a gap, and in that gap is your freedom to choose your response. Now, the question is, when you look at your own life, and when you look at how you react to things, how big is that gap? Do you really have the freedom, or do you respond as I often do, automatically? And if I respond or react automatically, there's no freedom in it. That gap doesn't exist. So it seems to me that the role of psychotherapy, how I define it to my students, and I've helped to develop a therapeutic modality called compassionate inquiry, and I'll be demonstrating some of that this afternoon in the workshop. But when I ask my students, well, what is it that we're trying to do? What is the essence of therapy? And you might think, well, it's to get rid of a depression, or to help somebody deal with an anxiety or an obsessive pattern, or to help resolve some emotional challenge. Well, those are legitimate aims. But for me, it's not the ultimate aim. For me, the ultimate aim is to help somebody arrive in the present moment in full connection with themselves. That's when there's freedom. When we're not laboring under what Peter Levine calls the tyranny of the past, where we're actually in the present moment, and we're not just coming from our heads, from our ideas, we're fully connected to ourselves. And that loss of connection to ourselves, and that subjection to the tyranny of the past, is the very essence of trauma. Is the very essence of trauma. Now, it should be rather unnecessary these days to have to talk to you about trauma, or to even prove to you that it's important to talk to you about trauma. I know that you've had 2 wonderful talks in the last 2 days on trauma, one by Nadine Burke, who has done pioneering work in establishing the adverse childhood experiences studies as the basis of understanding human challenges and human experience here in California. And the other from Amy Apogee, who talked to you about the biology of trauma. But it's almost absurd. And I think Nadine made the point yesterday. I wasn't here, but I understand that it's absurd that we even have to talk about it. But let me tell you 2 horror stories about adverse childhood experiences, which have been beyond a shadow of a doubt and repeatedly shown to be so related to adult pathology, whether of mind or body, whether you're talking about autoimmune disease, or malignancy, depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar illness, anything you want. The correlation between childhood adversity and these adult outcomes have been so clearly established. Well, let me tell you 2 stories about ACEs. So the ACE studies the adverse childhood experiences studies, were done here in California, as many of you might know. They were done originally in San Diego, within the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system. And they were initiated by a physician called Vincent Felitti. Felitti is now retired since mid-80s, I think. Wonderful man. He was an internal medicine specialist at an obesity clinic. And they found that they could help people lose weight with a rigorous program of dietary control and so on, but they couldn't help them keep it off. And then Vince did something quite extraordinary for a medical doctor. He actually listened to his patients. And they said to him, "Don't you realize what's going on? We're stuffing down our pain. We're stuffing down our pain. So Vince then helped to initiate these studies, and lo and behold, that they showed that for each of these adverse childhood experiences like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and so on, parent dying, a parent being jailed, you know them all. The risk of addiction goes up exponentially. They don't add up, they multiply. The risk of autoimmune disease goes up, depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. Well, 7 years ago, I was at an addiction conference in Norway. I was one of the main speakers. There were two other main speakers. They were unfortunately Americans, and one of them is one of the writers of one of the versions of the DSM. I mean, if I mentioned his name, you'd know it. I'm not going to name him because I don't want to shame him, but. He's one of the writers of the DSM and a critic of the DSM, one of the best-known psychiatrists in the U.S. The other keynote speaker, besides myself, was somebody who's as high up in the cognitive behavioral treatment therapy as you can get. Literally as high up as you can get in that world. Won't name that person either. But the night before the conference, we had dinner together, and I asked one of them, "Where do you live?" And they said, I live in San Diego. So I said, naively, "Oh, you must know Vince Felitti." And they said, "No, who's that?" I said, "Well, Felitti is the lead author of one of the most important studies ever done, published in all kinds of major medical and psychological journals, called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies." They both said, "What are those?" This is 20 years after those studies were first published. What we're talking here is a tremendous resistance to trauma awareness that still pervades much of the medical and the and the therapeutic world. And I'll tell you the other horror story, which is even more curious, if you will. After my book on addiction came out 15 years ago, I think about 12 years ago or so, I was invited to California to speak to a group of clinicians from Kaiser Permanente on addiction. They said, "We find your ideas very compelling. Would you come and talk to us?" I said, "Sure." So we arranged for me to come down to California. A month before the conference, I get an email saying, "Your ideas are very interesting, but do you have any proof?" And I said, "Yeah." There are these studies done by Kaiser Permanente. When I got to the conference, more than half of the clinicians had never heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. This is within the organization that actually initiated and, to their credit, published those studies. So when I talk about freedom, I talk about freedom from these unconscious forces. Because those adverse childhood experiences and other insults to human development, the major impact is not the pain that they impose. The major impact really is all the stratagems and adaptations that we take on to escape from the pain. And it's those adaptations and it's those escape mechanisms that then create all the problems. So when we talk about trauma, the major impact is actually our attempts to distance ourselves from the pain of the trauma. So the trauma is not the pain. The trauma, when I speak about it, is not what happens to us. The trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. So literally the word trauma comes from a Greek word for wound, wounding, that's what it means. So wound is something that hasn't healed, that you carry inside. So the example, obvious one, the trauma is not hit on the head, the trauma is the concussion. If you hit on the head, but you don't develop a concussion, you're not traumatized. You're hurt. You might be stressed, but you're not traumatized. So not everything that's painful and stressful is traumatic. Everything traumatic is painful and stressful, but it's not the way around. So let's not confuse trauma with pain. People can experience pain and not be traumatized. Now, it's in the nature of traumatic pain, of course, that it creates more pain because of the fact that the message that accompanied the traumatic event is embedded in the nervous system, and that's a painful message. So you might say about trauma that it's a pain that hasn't healed. And it's also the adaptations against the pain that you keep employing to keep running away from the pain. Now, in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, it says, whatever you do, don't shut off your pain. Accept your pain and remain vulnerable. And that actually, of course, is your job and my job as therapists, is not to help people become vulnerable. People are vulnerable. I mean, in the strict sense of the word, everybody's vulnerable. Vulnerable simply means woundable, from the Latin word vulnerare, to wound. As human beings, we're all profoundly vulnerable from conception until death. But so many of us shut down our awareness of our vulnerability. So when he says be vulnerable, it means be aware of your vulnerability and accept it. Not accepting your vulnerability is what leads you into more trouble later on. But of course, when you're small and helpless, it's impossible to accept your vulnerability unless there's some support for it. So really, from that point of view, the essence of trauma is emotional pain for which there was no relational context where the pain could be held. Now it's very obvious. Let me just do a quick test here. Don't raise your hand if you're not comfortable with this. But if you're abused as a child, and if you're willing to acknowledge it, just raise your hand, okay? All right, thank you. Do you mind then? Let me ask you. So, is it okay if I ask you something? How long, over what period of time did it go on for? Whatever happened to you?
It was just a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes? Who did you speak to about it?
No one.
No one. Okay, who else had their hand up? How long did it go on for in your case?
Years.
Years. Who did you speak to about it? When it was happening? No one. That's the trauma. The trauma happened before the traumatic event happened. So the primary trauma was not the abuse. The abuse was traumatic. I'm not saying it wasn't, but it wasn't the primary trauma. The primary trauma is that you were alone and there was nobody there to notice it. And you didn't feel safe enough to go to anybody because you already knew that there's no protection for you. And that's what made the abuse possible. Tomorrow I'm giving an event in Los Angeles with really the top stunt woman in Hollywood, Kimberly Shannon Murphy, who just got a Lifetime Achievement Award from Hollywood for her work as a stunt person. And Kimberly was sexually abused by her grandfather all throughout her childhood. But what made it possible is that she already knew that there's nobody she could go to. So that being cut off from human connection is actually the essence of trauma. That's the essence of trauma. So anyway, he says, whatever you do, don't shut off your pain, accept your pain, and remain vulnerable. However desperate you become, accept your pain as it is, because it in fact trying to hand you a precious gift, the chance of discovery through spiritual practice, what lie behind sorrow. When he says spiritual practice, I would also say through therapeutic practice, what lies behind sorrow. So underneath that pain, there's some truth about yourself. And my fundamental belief is that the healing capacity, which simply means our capacity for wholeness, because healing literally means wholeness, it's within all of us. It's never destroyed. It's never broken. Nobody's damaged goods. So then it's a question of how to help people reconnect with their wholeness when they lost contact with it. And that loss of contact with wholeness, with our true selves, is the essence of trauma. And that's what the DSM does you no damn good whatsoever. You know, Zach mentioned the DSM. I recall a comment that Dan Siegel once made about the DSM. He said, the DSM deals in categories, not in pain. And yet everything that you deal with therapeutically, no matter what that diagnosis is, has to do with pain and people's desperate attempts to escape from pain. And I'll talk to you about some of those attempts to escape from pain in a minute. But let's just look at our thinking. I said in the beginning that we have to question our assumptions. We have to question the way we think about things. Let me try an interesting test with you. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you have or have had depression, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, borderline personality disorder. Just raise your hand, okay? What a sick bunch. Okay, now, thank you. Well, let me tell you something. You just spoken on truth. None of you ever had any of those things. What are you talking about? It's the way we think about things. Now, from a certain point of view, I get it. At one time or another, you were diagnosed with one thing or another. So you think you had this one thing or another. But think of the word having. Just think about how we talk about, how we use words. Now, I have a cell phone, yeah? I can pick it up, I can use it, I can shut it off, I can put it down, but it's no part of me. It's got an independent life and independent characteristics that has nothing to do with me. If I lost it, I'd not be any different. I'd just get another one. I have a cell phone. It's an object separate from me. No part of me. When you say, I have depression, or I have multiple sclerosis, or I have rheumatoid arthritis, or I have ADHD, or I have bipolar disorder, you're making an assumption. The assumption is that there's a thing called rheumatoid arthritis, and there's a thing called multiple sclerosis, and there's a thing called depression, and there's a thing called ADHD, which is separate from me. It's got a life of its own. I have this thing for some reason. Somehow it's entered me. Really? What if we recognized that these aren't things with lives of their own? What if we recognized that these diagnoses represent processes that occurred in your life as a result of your life, as a result of your multi-generational family history, as a result of the state of your mind, of your mother when she was pregnant with you, as a result of the conditions of your birth, as a result of the conditions of your upbringing, as a result of the state of your community, your extended family, as a result of the culture in which you happen to live, well, then it's not a thing that anybody has. So nobody has these things. These words are descriptors of a process that's happening inside you. And that process has everything to do with how you live your life. And if you change how you live your life, that is to say, if you change your relation to yourself, that process can change. But it does not have a life of its own. Do you understand? So nobody has these things. These are processes occurring as a manifestation of something off balance about their lives. And that's what we have to discover, is what are off balance and how can we restore the balance. So that's one point in how we, in our own facile way, think about things. The other point is this, and I think Zach alluded to this. Diagnoses don't explain anything. They don't explain a thing. So I've been diagnosed. My first book that I wrote when I was age 55, Scattered Minds on Attention Deficit Disorder, in which I argued that this wasn't a genetic disease or a disease at all. It had to do with the life process and adaptation. But let's look at this issue of diagnosis that is explaining things. So what are the hallmarks of ADHD? Well, absent-mindedness, tuning out, difficulty paying attention when you're bored. I mean, that's just me. Poor impulse control. Yeah, that's me too. I could give you all kinds of examples. My wife could give you many more. And hyperactivity, which may or may not be there. So let's look at this explanation. Gabor has ADHD, which I was diagnosed with in my mid-50s. Gabor has ADHD. How do we know? Well, he's hyperactive, he tunes out, and he's got poor impulse control. Oh. Why does he have poor impulse control, and why does he tune out? Because he's got ADHD. How do we know he's got ADHD? Well, he tunes out. Yeah. What have you explained? Nothing. So-and-so has depression. Oh yeah, how do we know? Well, because their mood is low, their affect is flat, they socially isolate. Oh, okay. Why is their mood low? Why is their affect flat? Why do they socially isolate? Because they have depression. How do we know they have depression? Well, what have you explained? You've described something. It may be helpful to describe something. It is helpful to describe something, but never confound the explanation. I'm sorry, never confound the description with an explanation. Don't do that. They don't. And don't fall into the mistake of medical practice then to ascribe biological causes to these so-called explanations, which are no more than descriptions. For example, as a physician, I used to prescribe SSRIs. I've taken them myself, actually, and they even help me. So there's this theory that depression is caused by lack of serotonin in your brain, and when you elevate serotonin levels by means of medications such as fluoxetine or paroxetine or Celexa or Zoloft, whatever, then you're restoring the serotonin balance and therefore treating the depression, which was caused by lack of serotonin in the first place. You know how much proof there is for that theory? How much scientific proof? Zero, zilch, nothing. Never been demonstrated, never been proven. Oh yeah? Well then how come that serotonin can sometimes help depression? It's true, it can. But it's the same thing as if you went to a party and you were shy and reticent and you were withdrawn, and then you had a shot of vodka, and all of a sudden you became voluble and sociable and friendly and fun to be with. Would that prove that your social reticence was caused by lack of vodka in your brain? So we make all these facile assumptions. Now it's true. The biology of the brain can be disturbed, but what creates the disturbance in the first place is not some genetic conditioning. Here's the deal. Nobody's ever found any single gene that causes any mental health conditions. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you have them, you'll have this condition. If you won't, you won't. Nobody's ever found any such genes. They have found genes that the more of them you have, the more likely to have any number of mental health conditions, but you can also have the same genes and have no mental health condition at all, in fact be superior in your functioning. And this has been shown both in monkeys and in human beings. So what people are inheriting are not mental health diseases. Now there are some diseases that are genetic, very rare. If you have the gene, you'll have the disease. One of them runs in my family, muscular dystrophy. If you have the gene, those people in each generation who inherit the gene, they'll get the disease. That's very, very, very rare. In the mental health field, by and large, there's no such thing. What's being inherited is vulnerability. I should say sensitivity. And sensitivity, from the Latin word sensere, to feel, means that you just feel more. And if you feel more, when things go badly, you suffer more. And when you suffer more, you have more of a need to escape from the suffering by various coping mechanisms. But it also means that if you're born with the same genes and you get the right support from the environment, you will be an outstanding leader and a creative, intuitive, wonderful person. Same thing is true for monkeys. You can have certain monkeys with a certain gene. They'll be hyper-reactors, they'll be aggressive, they'll be impulsive. But you put them with super nurturing mothers, and those same monkeys become leaders and confident and non-reactive. And so, again, let's not confuse brain biology with genetics. The biology of the brain is, to quote from a Harvard article, is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. I just quoted to you from an article in the Journal of Pediatrics published 2012 by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. In other words, the development of the brain is an ongoing process that begins from birth to adulthood. And the good news is that even in late adulthood, given the right conditions, people can develop new circuits to overcome the older ones. And that's one of the jobs of therapy, is to help people develop new circuits to override the older ones. that were programmed in by traumatic events. And then another part of the same article says that it's the interactions of genes and experiences that shapes the development of the brain, and is critically influenced by what? It's critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. And that means that the most important influence on the biology of the brain, on how much dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, prolactin, vasopressin you're going to have is the quality of your interaction with the nurturing adults. So whether we're looking at the biology of the brain, or whether we're looking at the psychology of the mind, we're looking at the impact of life experience. And what cannot be separated in real life, but is unfortunately still very much separated in medical practice, is number one, the mind from the body, from the emotions, from the physiology, on the one hand, and the individual from the environment. So in the Western world, we tend to have this very individualistic view of human beings, and we think that everything that happens simply inside a particular organ, inside a particular individual, when in fact it's actually much more complex than that. And Bessel van der Kolk has said in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, that our culture teaches us to focus on our personal uniqueness, but on a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. How could we, when from the time that we're one-celled organisms, we're affected by the emotional states of the mother, whose emotional states are affected by her relationship with her spouse, all of which happens in the context of as I said before, an extended family, multi-generational family history, and a particular culture. So let me sum it up for you, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about healing. So here's what I'm saying. That trauma is not the bad things that happen to us. Those are the traumatic events. Trauma is the wound that we sustained internally that we still carry, and our defenses against that wound. And that's a good thing. Excuse me. Because if trauma is what happened to us all those years ago, it's over. There's nothing we can do about it. And that's why I'm not much of a believer in belaboring and spending endless time going over the childhood traumas. Because they happened. They never not have happened. But they're not the problem, fortunately. The problem is the wound that we still carry about it and our reactions to that wound. And that can be healed in the present moment. And when I said that our job as therapists is to bring clients into full connection with themselves in the present moment, that's what I'm talking about. If I connect with myself in the present moment, it doesn't matter what happened 80 years ago. Not that it doesn't matter, but it's not going to control me anymore. That gap between stimulus and response will open up. And I'm not going to be programmed by something that happened all those years ago. And I'll be connected to myself. I'm going to show you some pictures as a way of bringing this talk to an end as to how I approach healing itself and therapy that I'll be talking about and demonstrating this afternoon. I'm giving you general principles here. Let's have the first photograph here, okay? Mike? Yeah, there it is. So what you see here is a painting done by my wife, Ray. And the painting is based on a photograph that's in the upper left-hand corner of the painting. It's a black and white photograph. It's in my book. The black and white version is in my book, The Myth of Normal, opens the first chapter, actually, and it's a painting done by my wife of me as an infant, and there's my mother. You can see my mother's wearing a yellow star. That's the yellow star that Jews had to wear under the Nazi occupation, which is when I was born in Hungary in 1944. It's a badge of shame that Jews had to wear. And my wife did the painting because she said she wanted to understand her husband. Because if you look in my eyes, that's not the eyes of a 3-month-old. There's a doctor, a Christian doctor, that came to see me 8 months later when I was 11 months of age, and she said that she's never seen such terror in the eyes of any human beings as in my own. Well, that fear, of course, has affected me all my life. And there's the great spiritual teacher and psychologist H. Almas, who said that the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. And I'm going to make a statement here now that I cannot not make, and I don't mean to make a political point. I'm making a personal point. There are children today living under bombs, under starvation, under terrible conditions. 19,000 orphans. I could go on. I can relate to what's happening to those kids because I lived that way for the first year of my life. And when I was 8 years of age, my mother took me to a psychologist because I was wetting my bed. I wet my bed till I was 13. And the pediatrician said, I remember, not the pediatrician, the psychologist said, I was in the room, she said, Madam, if the only thing wrong with this kid is that he wets his bed, you'll be very fortunate indeed. Well, as I could tell you, as my wife could tell you, as my family could tell you, as my niece Orly, who's in the room here with you, could tell you, that wasn't the only problem. But I'm talking about healing here now. And I'm not going into my own childhood history, but I can tell you that so much of my reactivity and so much of my compensation was an attempt not to feel the pain of all that. Like, for example, the message I surely got, one of the messages I got from the world is that I wasn't important, I didn't matter. I mean, that's just the message I clearly got. How could I got any other message? Especially when my mom gave me to a stranger when I was 11 months old to save my life. So, just a couple of things. Tremendous pain. How do you deal with pain? Well, addictions. So I developed addictive behaviors to run away from the pain. Every attempt, every addiction is an attempt to run from the pain. I can maybe talk about that this afternoon. But the other was, the message I get is I'm not wanted, I'm not important. My mother gave me to a stranger. How could I be important? The trauma is not that she gave me to a stranger. The trauma is that I decided as a result that I'm not important. Now, here's the bad news for all of you. If you're not important, you know what you do? You become a doctor or a therapist. Okay? Now they're going to want you all the time, especially when they're in trouble. And boy, are you important. But it's addictive because you're getting it from the outside, what you're incapable of giving to yourself. And Bessel once said to me, after I gave a talk on addiction, he said, you know, Gabor, you don't have to drag Auschwitz around with you everywhere you go. And it took me a while. But you know what? That same photograph that bespeaks such tragedy, I mean, my grandparents being killed in Auschwitz, my father being away in forced labor, my mother giving me to a stranger to save my life. I don't see her for 6 weeks. When I see her again, I won't even look at her. I mean, so all my life, that's given me a very negative view of the world. I remember being in a ketamine healing group, and we're injecting with the ketamine, and everybody is uniting with God and singing with the angels and experience the oneness of the universe, and it's also wonderful. And I'm sitting there screaming, I hate the world. Well, how else? How else would I respond to the world? But then, healing happens, you see. And you can look at that same picture and that same scene from a totally different point of view. Is how amazing it is that I even survived. And how amazing it is, the incredible love that this 24-year-old mother of mine could have had to hand me to a stranger. Can you imagine? A strange Christian woman. And she doesn't know if she'll ever see me again. But she doesn't know if she can live another day. So she has the love in her to give me to the stranger. The love of the universe manifested by that Christian woman who then takes me into a place of relative safety. Is it such a horror story? Or is it a story of human love and the love that the universe can bestow on all of us? It is a matter of perspective, you know. And as somebody said, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And Buddha said that it's with the minds that we create the world, which is true. How you see the world is the world that you live in. What the Buddha didn't say is that before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. And our job as therapists is to explore the minds with which our clients create the world that they live in which they create repeatedly their own suffering. Not to blame them for it, but to help it to bring it to consciousness. And that pain that they've been running away from, to help them experience it in a safe context. Because when they first felt the pain originally, had there been anybody there to hold them with their pain, they would not have been traumatized. So your job is not to get people out of pain, it's to help them relate honestly to the pain that's in them as adults, you know. Now, I'm going to show you some other pictures. This one here, the next one please, Mike. That one. Okay, now, those of you who are physicians, and if you look at this rash, she's got this red rash on both her cheeks and a red bridge across the nose. It looks like a butterfly. It's called the butterfly rash. The doctors here have already made the diagnosis, systemic lupus. This is one of those autoimmune diseases where the immune system attacks the body. So the same immune system that's meant to protect you turns against you and destroys your tissues. It's a potentially fatal illness. This woman, her name is Valentina. She came to a talk of mine in London 5 years ago. Next picture, please. And if you can see her fingers, they're yellow like chalk because the blood supply has been cut off to her fingers as a result of this disease. She was told, you've got this thing called lupus. You'll have it for the rest of your life. We don't know what causes it. There's no cure for it. And you'll be on medication for the rest of your life just to control the symptoms, and it's probably going to get worse. Because again, this medical ideology that things are purely biological, that they're sort of distinct things that people have. Well, there are certain characteristics of people that develop autoimmune disease. I won't give you a big talk on it now, but tend to be people who emotionally repress themselves, especially healthy anger. They tend to be automatic caregivers for the emotional needs of others while ignoring their own. Did I say they tend to repress healthy anger? So they're very, very nice people. I always worry about the very nice people, to tell you the truth. They tend to believe that they must never disappoint anybody and that they're responsible for what other people feel. These are the people, without exception, who get autoimmune disease. It's also, not just in my opinion, but also according to a lot of research, and it's also why 80% of autoimmune disease happens to women. Because who's in this society who's acculturated to behave in those ways? It's women. It's not gender-driven, it's culture-driven. And if you're a black woman, a woman of color, your chance of autoimmune disease is even higher because of the intersectionality of being a woman and being a woman of a minority. So whether in Canada or New Zealand or North America, indigenous women have higher risks of autoimmune disease than anybody else. And it's got nothing to do with genetics, because prior to colonization, they didn't have any of this stuff. So, Valentina came to my talk, and I said that you can actually liberate yourself from this stuff by becoming more authentic, more connected to yourself. The next picture. There she is with the red sash on. 3 years ago, she sent me this photograph. No lupus, no symptoms, no medication, nothing. She just changed. She just changed her relationship to herself, that's all, through a lot of therapy. And she dealt with her adverse childhood experiences, of which she had plenty. And that's the result. The next picture is her hand now. No Raynaud's, no discoloration. And then 3 months ago, she sent me a final photograph. And this is her and a new baby. So that's what's... That's what's available for people. I was going to show you one more video, but I'm not for lack of time. But I'm just going to tell you about one more thing when it comes to healing. So amongst the work that I used to do as a family physician, I also worked in palliative care. And palliative care is where you work with people who are dying. And these are people that were dying of diseases before their time. And interestingly enough, there was a nurse in Australia who 12 years ago wrote a book called The Biggest Regrets of Dying People. So go back to what I said, is that the biggest trauma is that disconnection from ourselves, where we stop being ourselves, we try and be what the world wants us to be. The great stress researcher Hans Selye, who found the physiological impacts of stress in a laboratory, he said that in the modern world, the biggest stressors are emotional one, and the biggest stress of all is trying to be who you're not. Our job is to help people be who they are. Of course, to help them do that, we have to be who we are. And that's the big challenge, of course. But this woman, a palliative care nurse in Australia, wrote this book called The Top 5 Regrets of Dying People. These are people who died before their time. And as I can personally attest, when you're working with dying people, you learn a lot about their lives. And guess what she found? She found what I found. And so these are people who are dying before their time. You know what their biggest regret was? The biggest regret was, I'd wish that I had the courage to be myself instead of what other people wanted me to be. In other words, I wish I had the courage to be my true self rather than what the culture demanded of me and my family's demanded of me. And the third big regret was I wish I'd had the courage to express my emotions instead of pretending. Because that suppression of emotion, well, look at this thing called depression. There's disease called depression, genetic disease of depression. No, it isn't. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. What gets pushed down in depression is the true self, is the true emotions, is the true anger. Why would somebody do that? Because early in life they got the message that who they were and how they were was not acceptable. And in order to be acceptable, they had to push down significant aspects of themselves. So the question for all of it, now disease can be a major teacher. Sheryl Crow, the singer and songwriter and musician, developed breast cancer. And she said that before the breast cancer, I always tried to please everybody else. I tried to be whoever they wanted me to be. And they always looking out for the needs for others. He says, the disease changed me. Changed my relationship to myself. Now, she says, there used to be voices in my head always telling me that whatever I did wasn't right. I've silenced them. What am I saying? I'm saying we don't have to wait for death to teach us these big lessons, to be ourselves, to be authentic. Your clients are coming in with some symptom, with some issue, with some challenge. The source of it is always that at some point they learned they mustn't be their true selves. So again, our job really is a liberating one. We have to liberate people to be themselves. Thank you. Thank you.